The heavy wooden doors of St. Patrick's Cathedral burst open, shattering the reverent silence of Sunday Mass. A disheveled man, his clothes in tatters and feet leaving muddy prints on the pristine marble floor, stumbled down the center aisle. The morning light streaming through stained glass windows cast an otherworldly glow around his wild, unkempt hair and matted beard. Father Michael Patterson froze mid-prayer, his heart pounding as whispers rippled through the congregation. The vagrant's eyes, piercing blue and filled with an unsettling clarity, met his own. "I am here," the man announced, his voice echoing through the nave, "because God sent me." Before we dive into this extraordinary story, take a moment to share where you're watching from in the comments and hit that like button. Your engagement truly means the world to us. Father Michael Patterson hadn't always worn the collar. 10 years ago, he was Michael Patterson, managing director at Goldman Sachs, with a corner office overlooking Manhattan and a lifestyle that most could only dream of. His wife, Rebecca, a pediatric nurse, and their daughter, Sarah, lived in a brownstone on the Upper East Side, their lives a picture of success and happiness that graced the society pages. But God, as Michael would later understand, had other plans. It began with Sarah's headaches, minor at first, dismissed by doctors as stress from her prestigious private school. When Sarah collapsed during her 10th birthday party, their world crumbled. The diagnosis was devastating: a rare brain tumor, missed by multiple physicians who had been too dismissive of a child's complaints. The next 6 months became a blur of hospitals, experimental treatments, and desperate prayers. Michael threw his fortune and connections at the problem, flying in specialists from around the world. He even took a leave of absence from Goldman, spending every moment by Sarah's bedside, reading her favorite stories and making promises he couldn't keep. Sarah died on a crisp autumn morning, just as the leaves outside her hospital window were turning golden. She was 11. The last words she whispered to her father were, "Daddy, don't be angry at God." But Michael was angry, furiously, destructively angry. He raged against the medical system that had failed them, against the God who had ignored their prayers, against the unfairness of a world that would take a child while leaving corrupt men to prosper. Rebecca couldn't bear the weight of their shared grief. 6 months after Sarah's death, she left for Seattle, unable to walk the streets that held so many memories. Michael descended into a spiral of self-destruction, his work suffering as he sought solace in expensive whiskey and riskier trades. The turning point came on a rainy night in Central Park. Drunk and contemplating the ultimate escape from his pain, Michael found himself stumbling into St. Patrick's Cathedral. He collapsed in a pew, soaking wet and reeking of alcohol. That's where Father Thomas found him, an elderly priest who, instead of judging, simply sat with him through the night. Sometimes Father Thomas had said, "God's greatest gifts come disguised as our deepest wounds." Those words haunted Michael. Over the next months, he became a regular at the cathedral, not just for Mass, but for long conversations with Father Thomas. The old priest shared his own story of loss, redemption, and the mysterious ways faith works in human hearts. Slowly, Michael began to see Sarah's death not as God's punishment, but as a call to something greater. When Father Thomas passed away 2 years later, Michael had already begun his journey toward priesthood. He sold everything, donated most of his fortune to children's cancer research, and entered the seminary. His Wall Street expertise, rather than being left behind, gave him unique insights into human nature and the workings of power. Now, at 45, Father Michael Patterson served the same cathedral where he had once sought refuge. His background made him an unusual priest, one who understood both material success and devastating loss, who could speak the language of both bankers and broken hearts. His homilies often drew from his past life, teaching about redemption not as an abstract concept but as a lived reality. Yet lately something troubled him. He'd noticed discrepancies in the church's financial records, patterns that his trained eye couldn't ignore. William Reynolds, the head of the parish council, had been evasive about certain donations. Father Michael's attempts to investigate had been met with subtle threats about maintaining harmony in the church community. The morning the vagrant burst through the doors, Father Michael had been wrestling with this very dilemma, whether to pursue the truth at the risk of scandals that could damage the church, or to maintain a peace built on lies. Looking into the stranger's intense blue eyes, he felt an inexplicable certainty that his carefully reconstructed world was about to be shaken once again. James Warner stared at the blank document on his laptop screen, the cursor blinking accusingly. Once a star reporter for the New York Times, his expose on church corruption had led to a priest's apparent suicide 3 years ago. The truth that the priest had been framed and was actually alive and hiding still haunted him, destroying both his faith and his journalistic confidence. Now freelancing for a local paper, he attended Mass not for spiritual comfort but out of a compulsive need to understand what he'd lost. Emily Thompson clutched her rosary in the front pew of St. Patrick's, her knuckles white with tension. 5 years after losing her son Matthew in a drunk driving accident, her wealthy in-laws still blamed her for letting him drive home from soccer practice with his intoxicated coach. They'd used their influence to turn the community against her, forcing her from their affluent circles into a modest apartment where she worked remotely as a graphic designer. The church had become her only sanctuary, though even here she felt the whispers and judgmental glances. William Reynolds projected an image of unwavering piety, his silver hair and tailored suits lending him an air of distinguished authority. As head of the parish council and CEO of a prominent real estate firm, he'd positioned himself as the cathedral's primary benefactor. Behind his philanthropic facade, however, lay a web of embezzlement spanning years. The church's restoration fund had become his personal safety net as his business teetered on collapse. Each Sunday he placed a conspicuously large check in the collection plate, money laundered from the very accounts he was stealing from. Among the regular congregants sat Alice Martinez, a retired nurse who spent her days volunteering at the church's soup kitchen. She had recognized something familiar in the vagrant's eyes the moment he entered, the same haunted look she'd seen in war veterans at the VA hospital where she'd worked. Her instinct told her this man carried wounds far deeper than his ragged appearance suggested. David Chen, a young medical resident, attended Mass sporadically, tormented by his role in a fatal misdiagnosis the previous year. His colleagues had covered for him, but the guilt pushed him to question everything he'd believed about justice and redemption. He often found himself staring at the Station of the Cross where Jesus falls for the first time, wondering if some burdens were too heavy to bear. In the choir loft, Sarah Anderson practiced her solos, her perfect pitch masking a lifetime of perfectly hidden pain. As the church's musical director, she used her gift to inspire others while carrying the secret of her brother's abuse by a priest in another parish decades ago. The settlement money had come with a silence that suffocated her faith but couldn't quiet her voice. And then there was Ryan Cooper, the vagrant whose mysterious appearance would shake their carefully constructed worlds. His true identity, a former priest who had uncovered a nationwide network of church financial fraud and been systematically discredited, remained hidden beneath layers of carefully cultivated anonymity. The mud on his shoes came from sleeping in parks across the country, following a trail of corruption that led him finally to St. Patrick's. Katie Sullivan, the church secretary, watched all of them from her quiet corner. In her 15 years at St. Patrick's, she'd become an unwitting repository of secrets, confessions whispered not in the booth but over paperwork, between hymns and during coffee hour. She'd observed William Reynolds' careful manipulation of accounts, noticed Emily Thompson's growing isolation, and seen the way James Warner's hands shook when he thought no one was looking. These souls, each carrying their private burdens, formed the tapestry of St. Patrick's congregation. Their stories intertwined in ways they had yet to discover, bound together by threads of guilt, grief, and a desperate search for meaning. As the vagrant made his way down the center aisle that Sunday morning, none of them realized that their carefully maintained facades were about to crumble, forcing them to confront not only their own truths but each other's as well. In the growing tension of that moment, their individual paths to redemption were about to converge in ways none of them could have anticipated. The vagrant's bare feet left muddy prints on the pristine marble floor as he walked deliberately toward the altar. His appearance, torn clothes, matted hair, and weathered face created a stark contrast against the cathedral's opulent interior. The morning light streaming through stained glass windows cast alternating shadows and colors across his features, giving him an almost ethereal quality despite his disheveled state. "I am here," he announced again, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed incongruous with his appearance. "Because there are truths that need to be spoken." The congregation sat frozen, caught between shock and fascination. Father Michael gripped the altar, his knuckles white, as he watched this disruption of his carefully ordered service. Outside, police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Officer Jack Bennett had received a call about a suspicious vagrant who had allegedly stolen from a nearby shop. The shop owner, as it happened, was William Reynolds' cousin, and the timing of the complaint seemed far from coincidental. William Reynolds rose from his seat, his aristocratic features twisted in barely concealed disgust. "This man is a thief," he declared, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "I received a call just moments ago. The police are on their way." He moved toward the center aisle, positioning himself as a barrier between the vagrant and the altar. But Ryan Cooper, as the vagrant had once been known, showed no sign of concern about the approaching sirens. Instead, he turned slowly, surveying the congregation with those penetrating blue eyes. "William Reynolds," he said softly, though his voice carried to every corner of the cathedral. "It takes a thief to know one, doesn't it?" The color drained from Reynolds' face. In the choir loft, Sarah Anderson's breath caught as she recognized something in the vagrant's bearing a hint of clerical training in his posture, the way he commanded the space. James Warner, the journalist, had already pulled out his notebook, his reporter's instincts telling him this was more than just a simple disturbance. "Your time of reckoning has come," the vagrant continued, still in that calm, measured voice. "Not just yours, William, but all who have turned this house of God into a den of thieves." His gaze swept over the congregation, pausing briefly on various faces: Emily Thompson, David Chen, Sarah Anderson, as if he knew each of their stories. Father Michael stepped down from the altar, his own past as a Wall Street trader giving him a unique perspective on the tension unfolding before him. He recognized the signs of a man about to expose profound truths. He'd seen that same determined look in whistleblowers who'd visited his office years ago. "My friend," Father Michael said, trying to project calm authority, "this is a house of God. Whatever your message, there are better ways to deliver it." But even as he spoke, he felt the hollowness of his own words. Hadn't Christ himself overturned the tables of the money changers? The vagrant turned those unsettling eyes on him. "Father Michael Patterson," he said, "you of all people should understand. Sometimes God's truth comes not in whispers, but in storms." He reached into his tattered coat and pulled out a worn leather journal. "In here are the names, dates, and account numbers. Every dollar stolen, every life destroyed, every truth buried." William Reynolds lunged forward, reaching for the journal, but the vagrant stepped aside with surprising grace. The first police officers appeared at the cathedral doors, their presence adding another layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. Emily Thompson suddenly stood, her voice trembling but clear. Let him speak. Her eyes, so often downcast in shame, now blazed with unexpected courage. "I've spent 5 years being silenced. Maybe it's time we all listen to someone who isn't afraid to speak the truth." The vagrant offered her a gentle smile, then turned back to face Father Michael. "You've been investigating the missing restoration funds," he said. "You've seen the discrepancies but haven't known how deep they go. Today, everything comes to light." The police officers hesitated at the entrance, perhaps sensing that this was more than a simple case of theft. The morning sun had fully risen now, sending shafts of colored light through the stained glass windows, illuminating the vagrant in a kaleidoscope of holy light as he opened his journal, ready to shatter the cathedral's carefully maintained facade of peace. The cathedral erupted in a chaos of whispered conversations and shifting bodies. Through the growing tension, James Warner made his way closer to the center aisle, his journalist's instincts overriding his personal demons. He recognized the journal the vagrant held. It was identical to the one that had been mysteriously delivered to his office 3 years ago, just before the story that had nearly destroyed him. "You," he breathed, his voice barely audible. "You were the source." The vagrant's slight nod sent chills down his spine, confirming a connection he'd never dared hope to make. William Reynolds had regained his composure, his face settling into a mask of righteous indignation. "This is preposterous," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through years of manipulation. "Father Michael, surely you won't allow this vagrant to disrupt our sacred service with wild accusations." But Emily Thompson had found her voice, years of suppressed anger finally breaking through. "Wild accusations," she challenged, turning to face the congregation. "Like the ones your family spread about me after Matthew's death? About how I was an unfit mother for letting him get in that car?" Her voice cracked with emotion, but she stood her ground. Katie Sullivan, The church secretary clutched a stack of papers to her chest. She knew what those documents contained, evidence she'd been quietly collecting for months. Her eyes met the vagrant's, and in that moment she realized he knew about her secret investigation too. From the choir loft, Sarah Anderson began to sing. Not the scheduled hymn, but a haunting melody that cut through the chaos, the same song she'd sung at her brother's funeral. The vagrant closed his eyes briefly, swaying slightly to the music, before opening them with renewed purpose. Father Michael found himself torn between his duty to maintain order and an increasing certainty that this disruption was divinely ordained. His years on Wall Street had taught him to recognize the moment when a carefully constructed facade began to crumble. This was such a moment. "If you have evidence of wrongdoing," he said carefully, "there are proper channels." "Proper channels?" the vagrant interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Like the ones that silenced David Chin when he tried to report that fatal misdiagnosis? Or the ones that buried Sarah Anderson's brother's abuse case?" Each word struck like a hammer, causing the named individuals to flinch visibly. The police officers had moved inside now, but seemed uncertain how to proceed. Officer Bennett, leading the team, had been an altar boy at St. Patrick's years ago. He recognized the look of truth in the vagrant's eyes. It reminded him of his own mother when she'd finally spoken up about his father's abuse. Alice Martinez, the retired nurse, had moved to stand beside Emily Thompson, offering silent support. Other congregants began to shift in their seats, years of buried secrets and suppressed truths pressing against the walls of propriety and silence. William Reynolds made one last attempt to maintain control. "This man is clearly disturbed," he announced, his voice carrying a hint of desperation. "Officer Bennett, I insist you remove him immediately. He's already stolen from my cousin's shop this morning." Actually, a new voice rang out. He didn't. Reynolds' cousin emerged from the back of the church, his face flushed with shame. "You told me to call the police, William. Said it was for the good of the church. But I watched this man all morning. He never came near my shop." The revelation hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. The vagrant opened his journal, pages filled with neat handwriting and carefully attached documents visible to all. "Today," he said quietly, "we speak truth in God's house. No more secrets, no more lies." Father Michael looked up at the crucified Christ above the altar, remembering his daughter Sarah's last words, "Don't be angry at God." Perhaps he realized God's answer to his prayers had come not in whispers but in this storm of truth that threatened to tear down everything, and in doing so might finally build something real. The morning sun blazed through the stained glass windows, casting the scene in brilliant colors as the vagrant prepared to reveal what was written in his journal. No one in the cathedral that morning could have predicted how their lives would be transformed by what came next. Father Michael's journey from Wall Street to priesthood after losing his daughter deserves at least one like. It's unfortunate he hasn't received it yet. Can you help change that? The vagrant opened his journal with deliberate slowness, each movement precise and purposeful. "Let's begin," he said, with account number 847392661, opened at First Manhattan Bank under the name St. Patrick's Cathedral Restoration Fund. His eyes fixed on William Reynolds as he continued, "An account that has seen over $12 million in donations pass through it in the past 5 years. William Reynolds' face remained impassive, but a bead of sweat traced down his temple. The vagrant turned a page, the sound echoing in the now silent cathedral. Interesting that only $4 million appears in the church's official records. Even more interesting that $3 million was transferred to a Cayman Islands account under the name Reynolds Family Trust." Father Michael felt his Wall Street training kick in, recognizing the complex money laundering scheme being unveiled. But it was the next revelation that made his blood run cold. "The remaining $5 million, the vagrant continued, his voice heavy with sorrow, was distributed among various accounts belonging to the families of abuse victims, not as compensation but as hush money." His eyes found Sarah Anderson in the choir loft, "including $200,000 to the Anderson family, contingent upon their silence about their son's abuse." Sarah's voice caught in her throat, her hands gripping the railing. "How? How do you know about Michael?" she whispered. "Because," the vagrant replied softly, "I was the priest who first reported his abuse. The priest who was silenced, discredited, and eventually forced to disappear." He turned to James Warner. "The same priest you were investigating when they fed you false information about my suicide." James Warner staggered slightly, his notebook falling from nerveless fingers. The story that had destroyed his career, his faith, it had all been a carefully orchestrated lie. Emily Thompson suddenly gasped, recognition dawning on her face. "Father Ryan," she breathed. "Father Ryan Cooper. You were at Matthew's funeral. You tried to tell us about the coach's drinking problem before the accident." The vagrant Father Ryan Cooper nodded slowly. "They transferred me the next day, called it a routine reassignment. But I had already started noticing the patterns in the church's finances, the way certain problems were made to disappear with large donations." William Reynolds finally moved, his composure cracking. "This is slander," he shouted. "You have no proof." Actually, Katie Sullivan spoke up, her voice trembling but determined. She stepped forward, clutching her own stack of documents. "I've been keeping copies of every suspicious transaction for the past 3 years. Everything matches." Officer Bennett had drawn closer, his police training warring with his Catholic faith. "Sir," he addressed Reynolds, "if these allegations are true." "Allegations?" Father Ryan's voice cut through the tension. "Tell them about the Cancer Research Fund, William. The one dedicated to children like Sarah Patterson. Tell them how much of that money actually went to research and how much went to your private accounts." Father Michael felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The fund he had established in his daughter's name, the millions he had donated, all of it potentially stolen, corrupted. "The proof is all here," Father Ryan continued, holding up his journal. "Every transaction, every cover-up, every forced silence, but more importantly," his voice softened, "here are the stories of those who were silenced. Their pain, their loss of faith, their struggle to find justice in a system that failed them." The morning sun had risen fully now, streaming through the stained glass windows and casting patterns of light and shadow across the congregation. In that illumination, faces showed a range of emotions: shock, anger, grief, and for some, a glimmer of hope. William Reynolds made a sudden move toward Father Ryan, his hand reaching inside his jacket. Officer Bennett stepped forward instinctively, but not before Reynolds had pulled out not a weapon, but a phone. "One call," he snarled. "That's all it takes to destroy whatever credibility you think you have left." But Father Ryan just smiled sadly. "Make your call, William. But remember, in God's house, truth has a way of coming to light. And today his light shines particularly bright." The tension in the cathedral reached a breaking point as Reynolds raised the phone to his ear, his fingers trembling as he dialed. The congregation held its collective breath, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would change everything. The phone in William Reynolds' hand barely completed its first ring before the cathedral doors burst open again. A tall man in an impeccable suit strode down the aisle, flanked by 2 others carrying briefcases. "That won't be necessary," William the man announced. Bishop Thomas Andrews, head of the diocese, surveyed the scene with cold efficiency. "Perfect timing," Reynolds said, relief flooding his face. This vagrant is making outrageous accusations." "Silence," the bishop commanded, his voice sharp enough to make Reynolds flinch. "Did you really think we weren't watching the accounts, William? That we wouldn't notice your clumsy attempts to cover your tracks?" The congregation collectively gasped as the bishop turned to face Father Ryan. "Though I must admit, we never expected you to surface quite so dramatically. Father Cooper." Father Michael stepped forward, positioning himself between the bishop and Father Ryan. "You knew," he demanded. "You knew about the missing funds, the cover-ups." "We've been building a case for months," Bishop Andrews replied. "What we didn't know was how far up the corruption went, or how many were involved." He gestured to his companions, who opened their briefcases, revealing stacks of documents. "We needed someone on the inside to expose the full network." William Reynolds lunged suddenly, not toward Father Ryan this time, but toward Katie Sullivan and her stack of documents. "You don't understand," he shouted, his composure completely shattered. "I had no choice. The business was failing. The payments were coming due." Officer Bennett moved swiftly, restraining Reynolds before he could reach Katie. The church secretary stood her ground, years of quiet observation giving her an unexpected strength. "I understand perfectly," she said. "I watched you steal from grieving families, from abuse victims, from cancer research. I understood every time you made me falsify a record." Sarah Anderson descended from the choir loft, her legs shaking but her voice steady. "My brother died by suicide last year," she announced, facing the congregation. "The settlement money bought our silence, but it couldn't buy back his life, his faith, or his peace." The tension in the cathedral had become almost unbearable. Some parishioners began to rise, moving toward the exits, while others drew closer, drawn by the unfolding drama and their own need for answers. Emily Thompson approached Father Ryan, tears streaming down her face. "You tried to warn us about the coach," she said. "If we had listened, if they hadn't silenced you." "Mrs. Thompson," Father Ryan's voice was gentle, "your son's death was not your fault. The same system that protected corrupt officials also protected that coach. But today that system begins to crumble." James Warner had retrieved his notebook, his journalist's instincts fully awakened. "I can help," he said. "I can make sure this story gets told properly this time. No cover-ups, no lies." Bishop Andrews nodded. "That's precisely what we're counting on, Mr. Warner. The church cannot heal until the full truth is exposed." Suddenly, William Reynolds broke free from Officer Bennett's grip. In his desperation, he grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the altar. "You don't understand," he screamed, swinging it wildly. "I did it for the church. Every dollar went to protect the church's reputation." Father Michael moved without thinking. Decades of Wall Street instincts merged with priestly compassion. He stepped into Reynolds' path, taking the full force of the candlestick across his shoulder. The impact sent him sprawling onto the marble floor. The cathedral erupted in chaos. Officer Bennett tackled Reynolds as more police rushed in. Parishioners screamed and scattered. Through it all, Father Ryan remained eerily calm, his voice cutting through the pandemonium with crystal clarity. "The truth shall set you free," he quoted, helping Father Michael to his feet. "But first it will make you very, very angry." The morning sun caught the brass candlestick as it clattered to the floor, sending reflections dancing across the walls like golden tears. In that moment of chaos and revelation, every person in St. Patrick's Cathedral knew that nothing would ever be the same. Bishop Andrews surveyed the scene, his expression grim but determined. "Let us pray," he said, his voice carrying over the tumult for the strength to face what comes next. "Because this is only the beginning." In the days following the dramatic confrontation at St. Patrick's Cathedral, the ripples of truth spread outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. James Warner found himself back at his old desk at the New York Times, his editor eager for the full story that would shake the foundations of not just one church but an entire system of corruption and silence. Late into the night, James pored over Father Ryan's journal, cross-referencing each entry with Katie Sullivan's meticulous records. The story was bigger than he'd ever imagined. The network of fraudulent accounts stretched across multiple dioceses involving dozens of prominent figures. But more compelling than the financial crimes were the human stories, the voices that had been silenced, the lives that had been shattered. "I need to understand something," James said to Father Ryan, who sat across from him in the newspaper's conference room. "Why disappear for 3 years? Why let me believe I'd caused an innocent man's death?" Father Ryan's weathered face showed the weight of those years. "Sometimes to expose a deep-rooted evil, you have to let it think it's won. Every church I was transferred to, every attempt to silence me, led me closer to the center of the corruption. And you, James, your story forced them to reveal their hand." Across town, Emily Thompson stood before the imposing gates of her former in-law's mansion. This time she wasn't alone. Sarah Anderson stood beside her, along with 3 other families whose children had been in the car with Matthew that fatal day. The coach's drinking problem hadn't just been covered up once, it had been systematically ignored for years, protected by donations and influence. Mrs. Thompson, Gerald Thompson, her father-in-law, greeted her coldly when they were finally shown into his study. "I thought we had settled all this." "We settled nothing," Emily replied, her voice steady. "You buried the truth with money and threats. But now we know about the other incidents, the other children at risk. How many donations did it take, Gerald, to keep moving the coach from school to school to school?" The color drained from Gerald Thompson's face as Sarah Anderson laid out the documentation, a pattern of cover-ups spanning a decade, all traced through William Reynolds' creative accounting. Father Michael, his arm in a sling from the candlestick attack, found himself spending long hours in conversation with Bishop Andrews. The diocese's investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing. The cancer research fund in Sarah's name had been used to launder money, but not all of it had gone to Reynolds' accounts. Some of the money, Bishop Andrews explained gently, was used to silence families whose children had been subjected to experimental treatments without proper consent. The same hospital where Sarah. Father Michael couldn't finish hearing the revelation. He walked out of the bishop's office and found himself in the cathedral's garden, where he had scattered some of Sarah's ashes. The weight of this new betrayal threatened to crack his renewed faith, until he felt a presence beside him. "Your daughter's death was not part of their scheme," Father Ryan said quietly, sitting beside him on the stone bench. "But her memory, her fund, they used it as a shield for their sins. The question now is, what will you do with this truth?" Katie Sullivan discovered her own courage growing with each passing day. As the investigation widened, more church secretaries and administrators came forward, bringing their own records and stories. She found herself becoming a mentor to these women, teaching them how to document, what to look for, how to protect themselves and the truth. "I kept these records," she told a gathering of church staff, "because someone had to witness. Someone had to remember. We are not just secretaries, we are the keepers of truth." Sarah Anderson's music took on a new dimension. Her choir performances became prayers of lament and healing, drawing crowds from across the city. She began composing new pieces that spoke of suffering, silence, and ultimately liberation. Her brother's story, finally fully told, became part of a larger testimony of survival and resilience. Michael wanted to silence his pain with death, she told James Warner during an interview. "I choose to transform it into song. Every note is a truth he couldn't speak, a pain he couldn't bear. But now, finally, his voice is being heard." David Chin, inspired by the breaking of silence, began investigating other cases of medical malpractice that had been buried. He discovered a pattern similar to the church's problems: hidden by money, victims silenced by settlements and threats. His testimony before the hospital board sparked another investigation, another layer of truth being uncovered. Through it all, Father Ryan remained a quiet but constant presence. His years of wandering had given him a unique perspective on how institutions could corrupt and be corrupted, but he also witnessed the incredible courage of ordinary people choosing truth over comfort, justice over security. "Each person's story," he told Father Michael one evening, "is like a thread in a tapestry. Alone, they can be easily broken or ignored, but woven together, they create a picture so clear and powerful that it cannot be denied or forgotten." The tapestry was indeed growing, each new revelation adding depth and detail to the larger picture. But as more people came forward, as more evidence was uncovered, darker shadows began to emerge. Powerful forces were gathering, preparing to protect their interests at any cost. The battle for truth had only begun, and some of the hardest tests still lay ahead. The first attempt at silencing the truth came not with violence, but with money. A prestigious law firm representing an anonymous client approached James Warner with an offer: $5 million in exchange for killing the story. The lawyer, sleek in an Italian suit, placed the contract on James's desk with practiced nonchalance. "Your career recovery would be assured," the lawyer suggested smoothly. "A position at any publication you choose, complete creative control. All we ask is your discretion." James looked at the contract, remembering the weight of guilt he'd carried for 3 years, the night spent drowning his shame in whiskey. "You know what's interesting," he replied, reaching for his recorder. "This is almost exactly how they tried to silence Father Ryan 3 years ago. Would you like to explain that connection?" The lawyer's facade cracked slightly. "Mr. Warner, consider carefully. Some stories are better left untold." "No," James said, his voice firm. "Some stories refuse to stay buried, and this one has already cost too many people too much." Meanwhile, Emily Thompson faced her own battle. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Strange cars parked outside her apartment. Her employer suddenly finding budgetary reasons to terminate her contract. But instead of cowering, she turned each threat into ammunition. Document everything Katie Sullivan had taught her. Every call, every incident. Build the pattern. Show their desperation. The threats against Sarah Anderson took a more personal turn. Someone leaked photos of her brother in his final days, trying to paint him as unstable, unreliable. The whisper campaign suggested he had imagined the abuse, that his suicide was evidence of mental illness rather than trauma. Sarah's response was to sing louder. Her choir performances now included testimonies from other survivors, their voices joining hers in harmony. "They tried to bury us in shame," she told her growing audience. "But we are seeds, and seeds grow in the dark." Father Michael discovered that his past as a Wall Street trader made him uniquely qualified to unravel the complex financial web. Working with forensic accountants, he traced money through shell companies and offshore accounts, following the trail of corruption back decades. "It's not just about the money," he explained to Bishop Andrews. "Each transaction tells a story. Each hidden account holds someone's pain, someone's silence." But his investigation stirred up powerful enemies. The hospital board threatened to sue for defamation. Banking executives warned about reputational damage. Even some of his fellow priests suggested he was damaging the church by pursuing the truth. David Chin's medical board hearing became another battleground. As he presented evidence of systematic cover-ups, he faced a panel of his peers, many of whom had participated in the very system he was exposing. "You took an oath to do no harm," he reminded them. "That includes harm by silence, harm by looking away." Father Ryan, still technically a fugitive from church authority, moved between these conflicts like a ghost, offering counsel, connecting dots, strengthening resolve. His years on the streets had taught him how to move unseen, how to gather information from the shadows. "The pattern is always the same," he told James during a clandestine meeting. "First they offer money, then they threaten. Finally they try to destroy your credibility. But if you stand firm through all three, truth finds its way to light." Katie Sullivan's network of church staff grew, but so did the pressure against them. Several were fired for unrelated reasons, others faced harassment or intimidation. Yet for each one silenced, two more stepped forward, armed with documents, testimonies, and a growing determination to expose the truth. The breaking point came when Gerald Thompson, Emily's father-in-law, held a press conference. Standing before cameras with practiced grief, he accused the victims' families of exploiting tragedy for financial gain. He painted William Reynolds as a dedicated churchman being persecuted for his faith. But Emily was ready. As Gerald finished speaking, she stepped to the podium with her own evidence, emails proving his knowledge of the coach's drinking, documents showing hush money payments to other families, and finally a recording of Gerald himself discussing how to manage the narrative. The press exploded with questions. Gerald's carefully constructed image crumbled on live television. Within hours, other prominent figures connected to the scandal began distancing themselves, leading to more revelations, more documents, more truth. Yet, even as the evidence mounted, the human cost grew. Sarah Anderson's choir lost its funding. David Chin's hospital privileges were suspended. James Warner received death threats. Father Michael found his congregation divided, with some longtime members leaving in protest. "This is how they maintain control," Father Ryan observed. "They make the price of truth so high that most people choose comfort over conscience." But something unexpected was happening. For each person who stepped away, others stepped forward. New members joined the choir. Other doctors supported David's testimony. Readers defended James's reporting. The very attempts to silence the truth were amplifying it. As the conflicts expanded, touching more lives and institutions, a fundamental question emerged: how many people would choose truth over comfort? How many would stand firm when the cost became personal? The answer was still unfolding, but one thing was becoming clear: the old systems of silence and power were facing their greatest challenge, not from any single revelation, but from the growing chorus of voices refusing to be silenced any longer. The Sunday morning that changed everything dawned cold and clear. St. Patrick's Cathedral stood against the pale winter sky, its spires reaching heavenward like fingers seeking divine intervention. Inside, an unprecedented gathering was taking place: victims and perpetrators, witnesses and enablers, all drawn together by an anonymous message that had circulated through various channels: truth will have its day. Father Michael stood at the altar, his shoulder still aching from the candlestick attack, surveying the crowded pews. In the front row sat Emily Thompson, surrounded by other victims' families. Sarah Anderson's choir filled the loft, their presence a silent testament to years of buried pain. James Warner sat with his notebook open, while David Chin stood near the back, still wearing his hospital scrubs from an overnight shift. The tension in the air was electric when William Reynolds entered, free on bail and accompanied by his expensive lawyers. Behind him came Gerald Thompson and other prominent figures implicated in the growing scandal. They took their usual seats of privilege, though their customary air of authority had been replaced by barely concealed anxiety. Father Ryan was nowhere to be seen. Bishop Andrews arrived last, carrying a thick folder marked with the Vatican seal. His face was grave as he approached the altar. "Before we begin," he announced, "I must inform you that the Vatican's investigation has concluded. The findings." The cathedral doors burst open with a bang. A team of federal agents strode down the center aisle, led by a stern-faced woman in a dark suit. "I'm Special Agent Sarah Martinez," she announced, "and I have federal warrants for multiple arrests related to fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy." The chaos that erupted was immediate and total. William Reynolds attempted to flee toward a side exit but was quickly intercepted. Gerald Thompson began loudly demanding to speak to his lawyers. Several other prominent parishioners tried to push past the federal agents, creating a scene of struggle and shouting that echoed off the ancient stones. Through the commotion, Father Ryan finally appeared, emerging from the confessional where he had been waiting. His vagrant's disguise was gone, replaced by simple clerical attire. In his hands he held his journal and a small USB drive. 3 years, his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. 3 years I spent gathering evidence, building cases, connecting dots. Not just here, but in cities across the country. A network of corruption so vast it seemed untouchable. William Reynolds, now in handcuffs, snarled, "You self-righteous bastard, do you know what you've done? The lives you've destroyed." "No," William Father Ryan replied calmly. "I exposed the lives you destroyed, the faith you corrupted, the trust you betrayed." Emily Thompson stood up, her voice ringing with years of suppressed anger. "My son died because you people valued your reputation more than children's lives. How many other Matthews are there? How many other families were silenced?" The federal agents were methodically working their way through their list of arrests, each name sending new ripples of shock through the congregation. Prominent businessmen, church officials, hospital administrators, the web of corruption was being exposed in all its vast entirety. Bishop Andrews opened his folder, his voice heavy with emotion. "The Vatican's investigation confirms everything. The corruption extends far beyond what we initially suspected. But today," he paused, looking at Father Ryan, "today we begin the process of healing." Father Michael stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of both his Wall Street past and his priestly calling. "For years we've preached about sin and redemption from this pulpit. Today we live it. The truth is painful, but it is also liberating." Sarah Anderson began to sing from the choir loft, a lone voice offering a hymn of lament that slowly grew as others joined in. The sound swelled, filling the cathedral with a profound mixture of sorrow and hope. James Warner's pen moved frantically across his notebook, documenting every moment of this historic morning. But he paused when Father Ryan approached him. "This is your redemption too," James Father Ryan said softly. "The story you couldn't tell 3 years ago, now it will be heard." The federal agents continued their work with professional efficiency, but even they seemed moved by the unfolding drama. Special Agent Martinez paused beside Father Ryan. "We couldn't have built this case without you, Father. Your work these past 3 years, it was extraordinary." "No," Father Ryan corrected gently. "The extraordinary ones are those who refused to be silenced. Those who kept records, who preserved evidence, who carried the truth until it could be told." As the morning sun rose higher, its light streaming through the stained glass windows, the full weight of the moment settled over the congregation. This was more than the exposure of corruption, it was the beginning of a profound transformation. The cathedral itself seemed to hold its breath, its ancient stones witnessing another chapter in the eternal struggle between light and darkness, truth and deception, justice and power. And in that sacred space, amid the chaos of arrests and revelations, something new was being born, a faith tested by fire and emerging stronger for its trials. As the federal agents led the last of the arrested officials from the cathedral, a profound silence descended upon those who remained. The enormity of what had just transpired seemed to hang in the air like incense, heavy with both sorrow and liberation. Sarah Anderson's voice from the choir loft had dwindled to a whisper, But in the silence she began a new song, not a traditional hymn, but a piece she had composed during her brother's darkest days. Other voices joined gradually, creating a tapestry of sound that spoke of grief, resilience, and hope. Emily Thompson rose slowly from her pew, tears streaming down her face. "Matthew," she whispered, then louder, "Matthew." Her voice carried years of pent-up anguish. "My son died because they chose silence. He died because money was more important than truth. But today," she turned to face the congregation, "today he is heard." One by one, others stood. A mother whose daughter had been given experimental treatments without consent. A former altar boy, now grown, who had carried his secret for decades. A nurse who had been fired for reporting irregularities. Each spoke their truth into the sacred space, their voices growing stronger with each word. Father Michael descended from the altar, removing his clerical collar in a gesture of raw humility. "For too long." His voice trembled. "We have hidden behind symbols and rituals. We have used God's name to cover man's sins. My daughter Sarah died in that hospital, and her memory was used to protect the very system that failed her." David Chin stepped forward, still in his hospital scrubs. "I took an oath to heal," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his profession. "But healing can't begin until we acknowledge the wounds. Every patient I've lost, every mistake I've been forced to hide, they haunt me. Today I choose truth over protection." Father Ryan moved through the congregation, touching shoulders, holding hands, his presence offering comfort even as the hard truths continued to emerge. He reached Katie Sullivan, who stood surrounded by other church staff members, their faces showing both fear and determination. "We were the witnesses," Katie declared, her usual quiet demeanor transformed by the moment. "Every document we filed, every secret we kept, we carried the weight of truth until it could be spoken. We are not just secretaries. We are not just staff. We are the keepers of memory." James Warner had stopped writing, his notebook forgotten, as he listened to the outpouring of testimony. His own voice joined the chorus, speaking of his years of guilt, the weight of believing he had caused an innocent man's death, the redemption found in finally telling the whole truth. Bishop Andrews stood at the altar, tears flowing freely down his face. "The church," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "has always taught that confession leads to absolution. Today, we as an institution must confess our sins. We must face our failures. Only then can true healing begin." Sarah Anderson descended from the choir loft, her music giving way to spoken word. "My brother died believing he was alone," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. "He died thinking his pain was unique, his burden singular. But look around, every person here carries a piece of this story. We are not alone. We were never alone." The morning sun had reached its zenith, pouring through the stained glass windows and bathing the congregation in colors that seemed to dance with their tears. Father Ryan returned to the altar, standing beside Father Michael. "For 3 years," Father Ryan said, his voice gentle but firm, "I walked the streets as a vagrant carrying these truths. But the real strength, the real courage was in each of you. Every person who kept a record, who remembered a detail, who refused to let their story die. You are the true heroes of this day." Emily Thompson approached the altar, carrying a photo of Matthew. She placed it on the steps, and others followed, photographs, documents, mementos of those who had been silenced. A spontaneous memorial grew, testament to both loss and liberation. The cathedral, which had witnessed centuries of prayers and confessions, seemed to embrace this moment of collective catharsis. The air itself felt charged with the power of truth finally spoken, of burdens finally shared. Father Michael looked out at his congregation, seeing not broken people but survivors. Not victims but warriors for truth. "This," he said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had walked through fire and emerged transformed, "this is what real faith looks like. Not blind obedience but courage to face truth. Not silent acceptance but bold witness to both darkness and light." As the memorial on the altar steps grew, as more voices joined in testimony, a profound sense of transformation filled the sacred space. This was more than exposure of corruption, more than justice being served. This was the birth of something new, a faith strong enough to face its failures, a community brave enough to bear witness to both sin and redemption. The light through the stained glass windows seemed to intensify, as if heaven itself was bearing witness to this moment of truth and transformation. Each story, like Father Michael's journey or Emily's fight for justice, deserves to be heard. By subscribing to our channel, you help these powerful narratives reach more people. Join our community of truth seekers and be part of something meaningful. Your subscription makes a difference. The shot rang out just as the evening service was ending. The sound echoed through the cathedral's vaulted ceiling, followed by a moment of terrible silence. Father Ryan crumpled to the ground, his white collar blossoming with red. William Reynolds' 19-year-old son Tommy stood at the entrance, the gun still smoking in his trembling hand. "This is for my father," he screamed, his young face contorted with rage and confusion. "You destroyed everything." Before anyone could react, Father Michael had already reached Father Ryan, cradling his head while Emily Thompson pressed her scarf against the wound. The congregation erupted into chaos, some running for exits, others frozen in shock. Officer Bennett, who had been attending the service, tackled Tommy as the gun clattered to the floor. "Stay with me," Ryan Father Michael pleaded, his hands becoming slick with blood. "Don't you dare leave us now, not when we've come so far." Father Ryan's eyes fluttered, finding focus with visible effort. "The journal," he whispered, "there's more." So much more his breathing became labored, each word a struggle. "Promise me you'll finish it." Sarah Anderson knelt beside them, her voice lifting in prayer, joined gradually by others in the congregation. The sound swelled, filling the cathedral with a desperate plea for divine intervention. David Chin pushed through the crowd, his medical training taking over as he worked to stabilize the wound. "The bullets lodged near his heart," David announced grimly. "We need an ambulance now." Katie Sullivan stood at the church phone, her voice shaking as she gave directions to emergency services. "Please hurry," she begged. "It's Father Ryan Cooper, the one from the news, the one who exposed everything." James Warner watched helplessly, his journalist's instincts warring with his human emotions. This wasn't just another story, this was a man he'd come to respect, even love as a friend and mentor. His hands shook as he reached for his phone, knowing this would be tomorrow's headline, but hating that fact with every fiber of his being. Through it all, Father Ryan's breathing grew more labored. His eyes found Emily's face, and he managed a small smile. "Matthew," he whispered, "he knows. He always knew. You were the best mother." His voice trailed off as his eyes began to lose focus. "No, no, no," Emily sobbed, gripping his hand tighter. "You can't leave us. There's still so much to do, so much truth to uncover." The ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, but they all knew they were too far away. Father Ryan's eyes opened one last time, finding Father Michael's face. The truth he managed, it costs everything, but it's worth. His final breath came as a sigh, gentle as a summer breeze. The cathedral fell silent, even the prayers dying away as the reality of what had happened settled over the congregation. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, unaware that within these sacred walls a light had just gone out. Tommy Reynolds sobbed in Officer Bennett's grip, the reality of his actions finally hitting him. "Dad said. He said Father Ryan was destroying our family. He said someone had to stop him." Father Michael gently closed Father Ryan's eyes, his own tears falling freely. "He gave everything for the truth," he said softly. "Everything." The ambulance arrived too late, its flashing lights casting red and white patterns through the stained glass windows. As paramedics rushed in with their equipment, the congregation stood in stunned silence, witnesses to a sacrifice they never expected and could never forget. Sarah Anderson's voice rose once more, not in prayer this time, but in lament, a keening that spoke of loss beyond words. Others joined her, their voices weaving together in a tapestry of grief and gratitude, honoring the man who had given his life to expose the truth. As the police secured the scene and the media began to gather outside, James Warner looked down at his phone, at the half-written article that would soon tell the world of this tragedy. But how could mere words capture the cost of truth, the price of justice, the weight of sacrifice? The truth had finally been spoken, but its final witness had paid the ultimate price. The week following Father Ryan's death cast a dark shadow over St. Patrick's Cathedral. The pews sat half-empty during services, the silence heavy with unspoken grief and fear. The memorial candles flickered endlessly, their light seeming dimmer than before, as if even they mourned his loss. Father Michael stood at the pulpit, struggling to find words of comfort when his own heart felt shattered. The investigation had stalled, key witnesses suddenly became reluctant to come forward. William Reynolds from his jail cell had begun spreading rumors that Father Ryan had been mentally unstable, that his death was a tragic but inevitable result of his delusions. How quickly they try to rewrite history, James Warner muttered during a late-night meeting in the church office. His newspaper had received pressure from advertisers to tone down their coverage. They're using his death to bury the truth all over again. Emily Thompson faced her own dark night of the soul. The sight of Tommy Reynolds pulling the trigger haunted her dreams, reminding her too much of her own son's violent end. Maybe Matthew's death was meant to stay buried, she whispered during a counseling session. Look what happened when we tried to expose the truth. Sarah Anderson's choir fell silent. She couldn't bring herself to sing, the music that had once been her solace now feeling like a betrayal. Her brother's story, so briefly illuminated, threatened to sink back into shadows. The choir loft stood empty, its silence a rebuke to their collective failure. David Chin received notice that his medical license was under review. The hospital board, emboldened by Father Ryan's death, moved to discredit him as a whistleblower. They're saying I was influenced by a conspiracy theorist, he told Katie Sullivan, his voice bitter. They're using his death to discredit everything he exposed. Katie watched as church attendance dwindled. Her carefully collected evidence seemed to mock her from its hiding place. Several of her fellow church staff who had come forward with documents requested their evidence be returned, fear overtaking their brief courage. Even Bishop Andrews appeared defeated. The Vatican's investigation slowed to a crawl, bureaucratic obstacles suddenly appearing at every turn. Perhaps he admitted during a private moment, the cost of truth is too high for our institution to bear. The media circus that had briefly surrounded Father Ryan's death quickly moved on to other stories. The narrative shifted subtly from exposing corruption to questioning the methods and motives of those who would challenge powerful institutions. Tommy Reynolds' youth and apparent remorse became the focus of public sympathy. His father's lawyer skillfully painted a picture of a confused young man manipulated by external forces, traumatized by attacks on his family's reputation. Outside the cathedral, protesters began to appear, not demanding justice, but calling for peace and healing through silence. Their signs read, "Let the past rest," and "Faith over division." Father Michael found himself standing at his daughter Sarah's grave, the weight of failure pressing down on him. "I'm sorry," he whispered to her memory. "I thought we could make things right. I thought truth would triumph." James Warner returned to drinking, the old familiar escape beckoning as his career once again threatened to crumble. His editor suggested he take a voluntary leave of absence until the controversy died down. In the church office, Father Ryan's journal lay sealed in an evidence bag, its secrets seemingly locked away forever. The USB drive had disappeared the night of his death, along with several key documents. Emily Thompson sat alone in her apartment, looking at photos of Matthew. Maybe this is what they want, she thought. For us to give up, to accept their version of truth, to let our dead rest in silence. The darkness of doubt crept through the community like a slow poison. Had Father Ryan's sacrifice been in vain? Was the truth worth such a terrible price? The very foundations of faith seemed to tremble. As winter descended on the city, St. Patrick's Cathedral stood like a wounded guardian, its spires reaching toward a heaven that seemed more distant than ever. Inside its walls, candles still burned for Father Ryan, but their light seemed to illuminate only questions, not answers. The truth had cost everything, just as Father Ryan had said with his dying breath. But in the darkness that followed, many began to wonder if he had been right about it being worth the price. The package arrived at the New York Times 3 days after Father Ryan's funeral, bearing a Canadian postmark and addressed to James Warner in handwriting he instantly recognized. Inside was a letter and a duplicate of the missing USB drive. "If you're reading this, Father Ryan's letter began, then what I feared has come to pass. But death is not the end of truth, it's often its beginning." James's hands trembled as he plugged in the drive. The files it contained were meticulously organized, each folder a carefully constructed failsafe against exactly this scenario. But it wasn't just financial records and testimonies, it was a complete confession and explanation from Father Ryan himself, recorded over his years of investigation. "My death was never meant to be the end," his recorded voice explained. "It was meant to be the key that unlocked everything." The revelation exploded across media channels within hours. Father Ryan had anticipated his own murder, documenting threats he'd received and naming those who made them. He'd created a network of trusted allies across the country, each holding pieces of evidence that only made sense when combined. Katie Sullivan received her own package copies of documents she'd never seen, connecting the local corruption to an international network of money laundering and abuse cover-ups. He trusted us to finish what he started. She realized, her voice breaking as she shared the findings with Father Michael. But the most stunning revelation came from an unexpected source. Tommy Reynolds, racked by guilt in his jail cell, began to talk. His father hadn't just suggested the shooting, he'd orchestrated it, using his own son as a weapon, believing that a tragedy involving a teenager would generate sympathy and discredit Father Ryan's work. "Dad said it would save our family," Tommy testified, his young face aged by grief and guilt. He said Father Ryan would be seen as someone who drove a kid to violence, and everything he'd exposed would be questioned. Emily Thompson, watching Tommy's confession on the news, felt an unexpected surge of compassion. They used him, she realized, just like they used Matthew's death, just like they use all our children. The evidence Father Ryan had compiled wasn't just about financial crimes. It revealed a systematic pattern of exploitation, using family bonds and personal tragedies as weapons of control. William Reynolds hadn't just stolen money, he'd orchestrated a complex web of emotional manipulation, using people's love and grief against them. Sarah Anderson discovered that her brother's abuse case was connected to dozens of others, all buried under similar financial schemes. The pattern emerged clearly now: how the church had used compensation as a tool of silence, how families' faith had been weaponized against them. "Your brother wasn't crazy," Father Ryan's letter to her read. "He was one of the first to see the pattern, and that's why they worked so hard to discredit him." David Chin received his own package, containing evidence that the hospital's experimental treatments had been part of a larger research fraud scheme, with kickbacks flowing through the same accounts William Reynolds had managed. Bishop Andrews, holding his own copy of Father Ryan's evidence, finally understood the full scope of what they were facing. He didn't just expose corruption, he told Father Michael. He exposed how corruption works, how it uses our best instincts, our love, our faith against us. James Warner, working through the night to compile the story, felt the weight of Father Ryan's final gift. This wasn't just evidence, it was a map of how power corrupts and how truth gets buried. Each piece had been carefully preserved and connected, waiting for the moment when his death would make it impossible to ignore. "The truth doesn't die with the truth-teller," Father Ryan's letter concluded. "Sometimes it's the truth-teller's death that finally makes people ready to hear the truth." As the revelations continued to unfold, St. Patrick's Cathedral stood witness to a transformation. The very forces that had tried to use Father Ryan's death to bury the truth were now being exposed by that same death. His sacrifice, far from silencing the truth, had given it a voice that could no longer be ignored. The darkness that had threatened to engulf them began to recede, replaced by a fierce determination. Father Ryan hadn't just given his life for the truth, he had ensured that his death would make that truth impossible to deny. The transformation began quietly, like the first rays of dawn breaking through a long night. It started with Tommy Reynolds, who requested to meet with Emily Thompson in prison. She found him sitting behind the glass partition, looking impossibly young and broken. "I need to understand," he said, his voice trembling. "About Matthew. About what my father's actions did to your family. I need to know the truth." That meeting became the first of many. Emily found herself sharing Matthew's story not with anger but with a mother's love that somehow encompassed both her lost son and this lost boy who had been manipulated into violence. Their conversations became a bridge between two kinds of grief, two forms of loss. Sarah Anderson resumed her choir practice, but with a difference. She began incorporating testimonies from survivors into her music, creating a new kind of sacred song that spoke of both wounds and healing. The choir loft, once empty, filled with voices that had been silenced for too long. "This is how we honor Father Ryan," she told her choir members, "not just by remembering him, but by continuing his work of giving voice to the voiceless." David Chin's medical license hearing became a platform for exposing the broader patterns of medical fraud. Instead of defending himself, he presented evidence of systematic abuse of vulnerable patients. The hearing room fell silent as families testified about experimental treatments and covered-up deaths. "I stand here not just as a doctor," he declared, "but as someone who has learned that healing requires truth, no matter how painful that truth might be." Katie Sullivan transformed her role as church secretary into something more profound. She began training other church staff across the diocese in document preservation and whistleblower protection. Her quiet efficiency became a powerful tool for institutional change. "We are not just witnesses," she would tell her trainees. "We are guardians of truth." James Warner's comprehensive expose, published as a series in the New York Times, won a Pulitzer Prize. But more importantly, it sparked investigations in other dioceses, other institutions. The pattern Father Ryan had exposed began to unravel similar schemes across the country. Father Michael found his ministry transformed as well. His homilies became more raw, more honest, speaking directly about institutional sin and the cost of redemption. The cathedral's congregation changed. Some left, unable to face the harsh light of truth, but others came, drawn by the authenticity of a church willing to confront its own darkness. "Faith that cannot face truth," he preached, "is not faith at all. It's just another form of fear." Bishop Andrews, working with Vatican investigators, began implementing systemic changes. Transparency became mandatory. Financial records were open to public scrutiny. Whistleblower protections were put in place. But perhaps the most profound transformation occurred in the relationship between victims and the institution that had harmed them. Regular meetings began, where survivors could speak their truth directly to church leadership. Their stories were recorded, preserved, and made part of the official church history. Emily Thompson started a support group for families affected by institutional corruption. They met in the cathedral basement, their circle of chairs growing larger each week. Tommy Reynolds' mother joined them, her own journey toward understanding and redemption becoming part of their collective healing. The truth Father Ryan died for didn't just expose corruption, it created a new kind of community, one built on the foundation of shared pain and collective healing. The very walls that had once contained secrets now echoed with honest voices. Sarah Anderson's brother was reburied with full honors, his story acknowledged and his suffering validated. At the service, Sarah sang not of sorrow but of transformation, her voice carrying the promise of renewal through truth. "We are not what happened to us," she sang. "We are what we choose to become." The cathedral itself seemed transformed, its ancient stones witnessing a new kind of worship, one that honored truth as sacred and courage as divine. The light through the stained glass windows fell on faces that were no longer afraid to be seen, stories that were no longer afraid to be told. Father Ryan's death had indeed been a key, but not just to evidence and exposures. It had unlocked something more profound, the possibility of genuine transformation through the brave embrace of truth. 1 year after Father Ryan's death, St. Patrick's Cathedral hosted a memorial service unlike any in its history. The pews were filled not with passive worshipers, but with warriors for truth, survivors, whistleblowers, advocates, and reform perpetrators alike. William Reynolds watched the service from prison, where he would spend the next 20 years. His son Tommy, granted leniency due to his age and cooperation, participated via video link from his juvenile rehabilitation center, where he had become a peer counselor for other young people manipulated by family pressure. Emily Thompson stood at the pulpit, her voice strong and clear. "A year ago we thought truth had died with Father Ryan. Instead, his death gave truth new life." She gestured to the walls, now lined with plaques telling the stories of survivors and those who fought for justice. These walls no longer hide secrets, they bear witness. Bishop Andrews announced the establishment of the Ryan Cooper Truth and Reconciliation Foundation, funded by recovered assets from the corruption scandal. The foundation would support whistleblowers, fund investigative journalism, and provide resources for survivors of institutional abuse. James Warner, sober for a year and recently appointed editor of a new investigative unit at his paper, presented the first annual Ryan Cooper Award for journalistic integrity to Katie Sullivan, whose quiet documentation had provided the backbone of their ongoing investigations. David Chin reported that the hospital had implemented sweeping reforms, with a new ethics board that included former patients and their families. Sarah Anderson's choir performed at medical school graduations, reminding new doctors of their obligation to truth and healing. Father Michael, his own journey from Wall Street to priesthood now serving as a testament to transformation, blessed the congregation. "The truth isn't always comfortable," he said, "but it is always holy." The cathedral itself had been transformed. Transparent financial records were posted monthly. A survivor's garden bloomed where once secret meetings had been held. The confessional booths remained, but they were now places of true reconciliation rather than buried shame. Most importantly, the culture of silence had been broken. Each Sunday during the prayers of the faithful, people stood to speak their truths, their challenges, their victories. Their congregation responded not with judgment, but with support, understanding that vulnerability was a form of strength. Tommy Reynolds' artwork, created during his rehabilitation, hung in the cathedral's entrance, a powerful reminder that even those who had caused harm could contribute to healing. The memorial ended not with a traditional blessing, but with Sarah Anderson's choir leading the congregation in a new hymn composed for the occasion. The words spoke not of blind faith, but of tested truth, not of easy grace, but of hard-won redemption. As the voices rose together, the afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows, illuminating the plaque beneath Father Ryan's portrait. "The truth costs everything, but it's worth the price." In that moment, everyone present understood they were not just witnesses to history, but participants in an ongoing transformation. The truth had not just set them free, it had made them whole. On the anniversary of Father Ryan's death, James Warner published the final piece of his investigative series. It wasn't about corruption or scandal, but about transformation and hope. The article detailed how one man's sacrifice had created ripples of change across the nation. The Ryan Cooper Truth and Reconciliation Foundation had already supported 50 whistleblowers in various institutions. Their stories led to reforms in hospitals, schools, and religious organizations across the country. Emily Thompson headed the foundation's Family Support Division, turning her own tragedy into a source of strength for others. Tommy Reynolds, approaching his release date, had established a youth program called Truth Heals, helping young people resist family pressure to participate in corruption. His artwork, depicting the journey from darkness to light, became a symbol of redemption through honesty. Sarah Anderson's choir had grown into a national movement, with survivor choirs forming in churches across the country. Their music spoke of both pain and healing, creating a new language for expressing difficult truths. Her brother's story, once buried in shame, now served as a catalyst for change. David Chin's medical ethics program became mandatory at his hospital, spreading to medical schools nationwide. The Ryan Protocol became shorthand for prioritizing truth and patient welfare over institutional reputation. Katie Sullivan's network of church staff had evolved into a formal organization providing training in ethical documentation and whistleblower protection. Her quiet revolution in administrative accountability changed how institutions handled sensitive information. Father Michael's congregation had grown, attracting people seeking authentic faith rather than comfortable illusions. The cathedral became known as a place where truth and spirituality coexisted, where difficult questions were welcomed rather than silenced. Bishop Andrews, working with the Vatican, implemented the Ryan reforms across multiple dioceses. Transparency became a cornerstone of church governance, with regular audits and public accountability meetings. The garden outside St. Patrick's Cathedral bloomed with healing plants, each species chosen by survivors to represent their journey. A plaque explained each plant's significance, turning the space into a living testimony of transformation through truth. Most significantly, the culture of silence that had protected institutional corruption began to crumble nationwide. Other churches, hospitals, and organizations started their own truth and reconciliation processes, recognizing that healing could only come through honesty. William Reynolds, from his prison cell, finally wrote a complete confession, not seeking mercy but offering it to those he had harmed by revealing the full extent of the corruption he had enabled. On the last page of his article, James Warner quoted from Father Ryan's final letter, found among his effects: "Truth is not just about exposing darkness, it's about creating space for light. Every secret spoken, every lie uncovered makes room for something new to grow. The cost is high, but the reward is nothing less than redemption itself." As the evening sun set behind St. Patrick's Cathedral, its light caught the words newly carved above the entrance, "The truth shall set you free," below, in smaller letters in memory of Father Ryan Cooper, who gave everything for truth. The truth had indeed cost everything, but its fruits continued to multiply, healing hearts and transforming lives in ways that even Father Ryan could not have imagined. If Father Ryan's story of courage and redemption has touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful narratives of truth and transformation. Share this video with friends and family who might find strength in this story. Don't forget to like and comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Father Michael's journey, Emily's strength, and Tommy's redemption. What moved you most about their stories? Would you like to hear part 2, where we explore the wider impact of the Ryan reforms across the nation? Let us know in the comments below. Together, we can keep these important stories alive.